Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal, absurd, and very real world of Roman politics, where the phrase et tu, brute, wasn't a metaphor. It was whispered at the edge of death, power, ambition, betrayal, all wrapped in togas and sealed with blood on Senate marble. This is the story of Gaius Julius Caesar. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's drifting off with me from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Julius Caesar was born in July of the year 100 BC. His full name, Gaius Julius Caesar. He belonged to the Julian clan, one of the most ancient families in Rome. But by the time Caesar was born, they had little wealth left, and not much power either. Still, the name carried weight, and Caesar would learn, very early, that names could move mountains. He was raised in the Subura district of Rome, a working-class neighborhood packed with noise, smells, and life. It wasn't the elegant villas of the Palatine Hill. It was tighter, rougher, filled with street vendors, thieves, teachers, and tailors. The kind of place where a boy learned fast, or not at all. Caesar's father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, served as a praetor, a mid-level magistrate. His mother, Aurelia, came from a more respected family, and it was she, not her husband, who shaped the boy's early life. She was disciplined, proud, and politically sharp, qualities Caesar would carry into manhood. But Rome wasn't stable. Power shifted constantly, like sand on a battlefield. When Caesar was just a teenager, the city was plunged into civil war. Two giants clashed for control. Gaius Marius, a populist war hero, and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a brutal aristocratic general. Caesar was related to Marius through marriage. His aunt was Marius's wife, and in the zero-sum world of Roman politics, that meant everything. Sulla eventually seized control of Rome and began purging his enemies. It was violent, cold, systematic. Heads posted in the forum, names carved into death lists, and young Caesar, barely out of boyhood, was told to divorce his wife. She was Cornelia, daughter of one of Marius's allies. Sulla demanded the separation. Caesar refused. It was a stunning act of defiance. Quiet, simple, and firm, but it could have cost him his life. He was stripped of his priesthood, his inheritance, his safety, marked as an enemy of the regime. So, he vanished. For a time, Caesar lived in hiding, constantly moving, often ill, sometimes broke. He joined the military and fought in Asia Minor, and there, far from Rome's marble halls and smoky taverns, he became a man. Caesar earned his first honors in combat during the siege of Mytilene. He showed courage under pressure, the kind commanders remember. He was awarded the civic crown, a wreath made of oak leaves, given only to those who saved another Roman citizen's life in battle. It was a quiet symbol, but powerful. It gave him the right to wear the crown at public events, and even the Senate had to stand when he entered the room. When Sulla died, Caesar returned to Rome, older, tougher, and no longer a shadow. He studied rhetoric in Rhodes, sharpened his speaking, and began the long, brutal climb through the Roman political system. He started with minor offices, military tribune, then quaestor, but his gift wasn't just in winning votes. It was in understanding people, how they thought, what they wanted, and how to make them believe he was the one who could give it to them. He wasn't loved by the Senate, but the people, they cheered him. He gave them games, feasts, grain distributions, all of it paid for with borrowed money, mostly from Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man. But Caesar didn't mind debt. He understood what bought loyalty better than coin ever could: memory. He moved fast, too fast for some, but everything he touched, from court cases to festivals to funerals, seemed to raise his profile. When his wife Cornelia died, he staged one of the most elaborate funeral speeches Rome had ever seen, publicly honoring not only her, but also her father, Cinna, another enemy of Sulla. It was bold, and it worked. He was elected Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome, over older, more established rivals. Rumors swirled of bribes, but the victory stood, and with that title, he gained more than religious prestige. He gained a house in the Forum and a permanent spotlight. Caesar knew the game, and he was just getting started. By the time Caesar reached his early 40s, he had achieved what many Roman nobles only dreamed of: wealth, influence, and the admiration of the people. But it wasn't enough. Not for him. Rome's political system had grown corrupt and chaotic. The Senate was fractured. Alliances shifted with the wind. And Caesar, he saw opportunity. Two of the most powerful men in Rome at the time were bitter rivals: Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the Republic, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general. Both wanted more. Crassus wanted new tax laws to protect his investments. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and legitimacy for his eastern conquests. The Senate blocked them at every turn, and Caesar, he offered them both something they lacked: a path back into power. He proposed an alliance, quiet at first, unofficial, even informal. It became known later as the First Triumvirate, a rule of three. Caesar would run for consul, the highest elected office in the Republic. With Crassus's money and Pompey's soldiers behind him, victory was all but certain. And when he won, he delivered. Laws were passed, land was distributed, debt reforms were enacted. Pompey and Crassus got what they wanted, and Caesar, he got a 5-year military command in Gaul, modern-day France, Belgium, parts of Switzerland, and beyond. It was a vast territory, filled with tribal unrest and opportunity. What came next would change the fate of Rome forever. He left Rome in 58 BC, not as a politician, but as a general. And in Gaul, he became something else entirely. The Gallic Wars were long, brutal, and relentless, but they were also brilliant, a showcase of Caesar's military genius. He wrote about them himself, in clean, sharp Latin, Commentarii de Bello Gallico. His commentaries on the Gallic War were part war report, part propaganda. He described the tribes he fought, the Helvetii, the Belgae, the Nervi, and how, with discipline and strategy, his legions conquered them all. Over the next 8 years, Caesar extended Rome's reach to the English Channel. He crossed into Britain twice, the first Roman general to do so. He built bridges across the Rhine in mere days to show the Germanic tribes that not even rivers could hold him back. His troops adored him. He marched with them, ate with them, fought beside them, and back in Rome, his victories made him a legend. Gold poured into the treasury. Slaves and spoils enriched the city. And yet, some senators grew nervous because Caesar wasn't just gaining ground. He was gaining loyalty. His soldiers were his, in heart and sword. Meanwhile, his old allies were unraveling. Crassus, eager to match Caesar's fame, led a campaign in the east and died in 53 BC at the Battle of Carrhae. His death shattered the balance of power. Pompey, now aligned with the Senate, grew wary of Caesar's rise. The triumvirate was dead. Only 2 men remained, and Rome wasn't big enough for both. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return home alone. But he knew what that meant. Without his legions, he'd be vulnerable, charged with treason, stripped of his titles, maybe even executed. And so, he made a decision. In January of 49th BC, Caesar led his troops south and crossed the Rubicon River, a small stream marking the legal boundary between his province and Italy. To cross it with an army was illegal. Treason to civil war. According to legend, he paused on the riverbank, looked at the water, and whispered, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. From that moment, there was no turning back. He marched toward Rome. Pompey fled the city, regrouping in the east, and Caesar, calm and deliberate, took control. But he didn't declare himself king, not yet. Instead, he pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean, through Greece, through Illyria, and finally to Pharsalus. There, in 48 BC, the 2 titans clashed. Caesar was outnumbered, but his tactics, swift, flexible, brutal, broke Pompey's lines. Pompey fled again, this time to Egypt. Caesar followed, but by the time he arrived, Pompey was already dead, assassinated by Egyptian officials trying to win Caesar's favor. They presented him with Pompey's head, and Caesar wept. Despite everything, Pompey had once been his ally, his friend, a part of Rome, and now that Rome was gone, after Pompey's death, Caesar remained in Egypt. It was not the Rome he knew. Egypt was older, slower, heavier, with ceremony and myth. It moved like the Nile, quiet, winding, patient, and deep. The kingdom itself was in turmoil. A civil war brewed between the young Queen Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy III. They ruled jointly in name, but not in spirit. And then Caesar arrived, not as a diplomat, but as a conqueror. Cleopatra, just 21 at the time, understood what was at stake. She smuggled herself into Caesar's presence, hidden in a rug, or perhaps a laundry sack, depending on which Roman historian you trust. However she arrived, she made an impression, sharp-witted, politically astute, fluent in several languages. She wasn't just a queen, she was a survivor. Caesar was nearly 52. They were an unlikely pair, but their alliance, and later romance, was real. He supported her claim to the throne. In return, she offered loyalty, resources, and something even rarer in Caesar's world, a partnership that felt equal. A war followed, the Alexandrian War, a tangle of fire and politics where Caesar's forces were briefly outnumbered, and the great library of Alexandria may have burned, though historians still debate what was lost. In the end, Caesar won. Ptolemy drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra ruled with her younger brother as co-regent, and she gave birth to a child, a boy named Caesarion. The name was no accident. Still, Caesar didn't stay. Rome called. He traveled through Asia Minor, where he defeated Pharnaces of Pontus in a swift campaign that would become legend. In just 4 days, the war was over. His message to the Senate was brief and brilliant. Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. It was the kind of line only Caesar could deliver, and only Caesar could back up. When he finally returned to Rome, he came not as consul or candidate, but as dictator. The Senate appointed him as such, first for 10 years, then for life. He declined the crown of king when it was offered, publicly at least. Rome had expelled kings 5 centuries before, and the word itself stung like a wound. Still, Caesar moved like one. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian system. He filled the Senate with loyalists. He expanded citizenship, forgave debts, rebuilt cities, and planned massive projects: roads, libraries, temples. He even planned a war against Parthia, Rome's last great eastern rival. But for all his reforms, for all his popularity among the people, there were whispers. Old senators remembered the Republic, and in Caesar's growing shadow, they saw the end of it. He dressed in purple, the color of royalty. He sat alone on gilded chairs. He took no colleagues, no equals. And though he spoke of tradition, he ruled by decree. To some, he was a savior. To others, a tyrant in disguise. And so, a plot began to take shape, not in darkness, but in candlelit rooms filled with wine and silence. The conspirators were not outsiders. They were senators, friends, colleagues, and among them, Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar had trusted, some say, loved like a son. They feared not just the man, but the idea of him, of what Rome would become if one name ruled forever. They called themselves Liberatores, the liberators, though what they'd free Rome into remained unclear. The stage was set, the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC. Caesar was warned. A soothsayer had told him, "Beware the Ides of March." He laughed it off. That morning, he debated going to the Senate. His wife, Calpurnia, had a bad dream, a vision of blood, of marble steps stained red. But Decimus, one of the conspirators, urged him to attend, insisted the Senate would be insulted by his absence, and Caesar, never one to show weakness, went. He walked through the Theater of Pompey, a building once erected by the man he'd defeated, and climbed the steps to meet the Senate. There were no bodyguards, just him and the blades that waited. The Ides of March. It was just another date on the Roman calendar, until it wasn't. Julius Caesar entered the Senate that morning, wrapped not in armor, but in confidence. He believed the battle for Rome had already been won. He had outlived Sulla, outmaneuvered Pompey, tamed Gaul, and ruled without rival. But this was something else. There were 60 conspirators. Some were old political rivals, some were once friends, and some were men he had personally raised to power. They had daggers hidden in their togas, short, sharp blades meant for one task only. There was no dramatic speech, no grand confrontation, just the soft sounds of sandals on marble, and a sudden blur of movement. The first knife struck him in the back. He turned, confused, not afraid. Then another, and another. He tried to fight, but it was no use. The men surrounded him like a storm of cloth and steel. He staggered, blood soaking his white robes, and then he saw him, Brutus, one of the last faces he ever expected in that circle of blades, his supposed ally, his near-adopted son. And what did Caesar say? That part is legend. At two, Brute, you too, Brutus. Or maybe it was silence, just a look, a breath, a collapse. Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, the man he had defeated, and in that irony, History seemed to pause. The body lay still. 23 wounds, not all of them fatal. But the betrayal, perhaps, was. The conspirators emerged into the daylight, believing they had saved the Republic, that the people would cheer, that Rome would be free again. But Rome was silent. The people didn't flood the streets in celebration. They stood in shock, because whatever Caesar was, dictator, reformer, or king in all but name, he had brought order, he had brought food, festivals, wages, security, and now he was gone. The Senate, unsure what to do, granted amnesty to the killers, but allowed Caesar's will to be read. It was unexpected. He had left money to every Roman citizen, public parks, generous provisions. The man they had stabbed had left them gifts, and suddenly, those conspirators didn't look like heroes anymore. They looked like murderers, like men who had torn down something without knowing how to rebuild it. Then came Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, fellow consul, and seasoned orator. He took the stage at Caesar's funeral, not with rage, but with precision. He read the will. He pointed to the body. He showed the bloodied toga. He let the people decide what kind of man had been taken from them. And Rome erupted. The crowd turned on the Senate, turned on the conspirators. The liberatores fled the city, some into exile, some into hiding, and some into war. But Caesar wasn't done. Not quite. He had named an heir in his will, a great nephew, just 18 years old, barely a man. His name was Gaius Octavius, later known to the world as Augustus. When Octavian learned of his adoption, he didn't hesitate. He traveled to Rome, took the name Caesar, and began building alliances of his own. He joined forces, temporarily, with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, forming what would become the Second Triumvirate. Their goal? To hunt down and destroy Caesar's killers. One by one, the conspirators were cornered. Cassius fell on his sword. Brutus, too, took his own life. After the Battle of Philippi, the Republic was over. What followed was chaos, another civil war, this time between Antony and Octavian. It ended at sea. The Battle of Actium, Octavian victorious. Antony and Cleopatra, defeated, chose death on their own terms. And Octavian? He returned to Rome, not as a general, but as something greater. He became the first emperor, not in name. He called himself Princeps, the first citizen. But in truth, he ruled Rome. The Senate still existed, but only in shadow. The Republic was gone. The empire had begun, and the man who made it possible, the man whose ambition, brilliance, and fall shook the foundations of the ancient world, lay in ashes, remembered with fear, admiration, and no small amount of myth. Julius Caesar, assassinated to save the Republic, and yet, in death, he cleared the path for its end. And now, the city sleeps. Rome, that ancient heartbeat of empire, falls silent under the weight of centuries. But Julius Caesar still echoes. His name did not fade with time. In fact, it grew. Long after his body cooled beneath Roman stone, his legacy hardened into legend. The month of his birth, Quintilis, was renamed Julius, July. Later emperors would carry his name like armor: Caesar Augustus, Caesar Tiberius, Caesar Nero. And not just in Rome. In Russia, the word became Tsar. In Germany, Kaiser. For thousands of years, across continents and languages, the title of absolute power would be his, Caesar. But legacy is a strange thing. He was called many names in life, Dictator, reformer, usurper, savior. To the patricians, he was dangerous. To the poor, generous. To his soldiers, a leader worth following into the unknown. To his enemies, unforgiving. And yet, he was also a man, made of skin and scar, driven by memory, shaped by fear, and undone by trust. He loved words. He feared weakness. He wept at Pompey's death. He lifted Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, in his arms, and he walked boldly, foolishly, into the Senate that final morning, believing himself invincible. It's easy to cast Caesar as pure ambition, but ambition is never simple. It hides inside justice. It waits in loyalty. It grows in silence. He did not live long, not by modern standards. 56 years. But in that time, he changed everything. Rome's calendar, its borders, its political system, its very concept of power. Before Caesar, Rome was a republic. After Caesar, Rome would never again be ruled without a single man at the top, even when they called it something else. He became a fixed point in time, a hinge between worlds, the last great man of the Roman Republic. There are statues of him still, not as many as Augustus, not as large as Constantine, but they stand not for what he destroyed, but for what he made inevitable. His story has been told in plays and paintings, in marble and silver, by Shakespeare, by Plutarch, by school teachers, and bedtime historians, not because he was perfect, but because he was real, fallible, relentless, and unforgettable. And perhaps that's what matters most. In the end, Julius Caesar did not become a god. He became a lesson on power, on pride, on how far a man can go before the world or the blade catches up. So, if you're still awake, you've wandered through the streets of Rome. You've sat in the Senate. You've stood in the shadow of greatness and seen the cost that follows close behind. But if you're asleep now, let the marble halls fade, let the swords rust, let the past grow quiet, because this was the story of Caesar, and you've earned your rest. Are you still awake? If so, we begin our next journey. Let the marble colonnades of Rome fade behind us now. We cross the sea, south and east, to the sunlit banks of the Nile, where the water flows wide and slow, and the air hums with ancient voices. Tonight, we drift gently into the world of Egypt and into the life of its last true ruler, Cleopatra VII. You've heard her name before, a whisper in a history book, a scene in a film, a metaphor for beauty, or danger, or power. But tonight, we'll leave the myths behind. This is her real story. She was born in 69 BC in Alexandria, a city carved by conquerors, but shaped by ideas. It wasn't the Egypt of pyramids and pharaohs long gone. This Egypt was Greek at the top, Egyptian underneath, and Roman at its doorstep. Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal family descended not from Egyptian blood, but from Macedonian generals. Her ancestor, Ptolemy I, had served under Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, his empire fractured, and Ptolemy claimed Egypt. He didn't just rule it, he made it his. His children became pharaohs, foreigners wrapped in Egyptian gods. But over the generations, the Ptolemies became infamous, not for their strength, but for their scandals. They married their own siblings. They poisoned uncles. They murdered cousins. Thrones changed hands in whispers and screams. Cleopatra was born into this fire. Her father was Ptolemy III, known not so flatteringly as Auletes, the flute player. a man more interested in music than ruling. He had spent much of his reign desperately trying to hold power, often by paying massive bribes to Roman politicians. The dynasty was fragile, the people were restless, and the Roman Republic was always watching. When Ptolemy XIII died, Cleopatra was just 18. She was intelligent, politically trained, and multilingual, fluent in Greek, and, unusually for her family, Egyptian. It made her rare, a Ptolemy who could speak to the people in their own tongue. She ascended the throne as co-ruler with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. Officially, they were equals. In reality, it was a struggle from the start. The court factions favored her brother. They wanted someone they could mold, someone malleable. Cleopatra was not that. She refused to fade quietly into the background. She appeared alone on royal decrees. She took bold positions on economic and religious matters. She made enemies. Within a few short years, she was pushed out of power, forced to flee the palace. She disappeared from Alexandria, but not from Egypt. She gathered allies, raised an army in exile, and waited. Then, fate intervened. Across the sea, Rome was bleeding. The civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great was reaching its peak. Pompey had fled to Egypt after losing the Battle of Pharsalus, hoping for sanctuary. Instead, he was murdered, beheaded on the shore by Egyptian officials, eager to impress Caesar. It backfired. When Caesar arrived and was presented with Pompey's head, he wept, not out of love, but out of respect. Pompey had once been his ally, his son-in-law, and a Roman. Caesar remained in Alexandria, torn between politics and principle. And there, into that moment of tension, stepped Cleopatra. She was smuggled into Caesar's quarters, most famously in a rolled carpet, though some sources say it may have been a laundry bag. What matters more is what happened next. Cleopatra, just 21 years old, faced the most powerful man in the world, not with fear, but with intelligence, with grace, with strategy. And Caesar was impressed. She didn't plead, she negotiated, not for herself, but for Egypt, her throne, her people. And so began one of the most famous alliances in ancient history. The alliance between Cleopatra and Caesar was more than political. It was personal, but it was not romantic in the way stories like to tell it. It was strategic, calculated. Two powerful minds, two ambitious rulers, each with something to gain. Cleopatra needed her throne back. Caesar needed Egypt to be stable and loyal. But not everyone in Alexandria welcomed Caesar's presence. The supporters of Ptolemy, Cleopatra's brother and rival, rejected Rome's interference. They rallied the army, besieged the palace, and tried to trap Caesar in the city. And so began the Alexandrian War. It wasn't grand in scale, not compared to Caesar's battles in Gaul or Greece, but it was tense, dangerous, desperate. For months, Caesar and his small force were surrounded in the palace quarter, fighting street by street, wall by wall. Supplies ran low. Fire broke out in parts of the city. Some say the great library of Alexandria may have burned during the chaos, though historians still debate what exactly was lost. The war reached its climax on the banks of the Nile. Ptolemy XIII attempted to escape by boat, but the vessel capsized, and the boy king drowned, just 14 years old. And with his death, Cleopatra's path to power was cleared. She was restored as queen, but Egyptian tradition demanded she rule with a male consort. She chose another brother, Ptolemy XIII, just 12 years old. Officially, they ruled together, Unofficially, Cleopatra ruled alone. Her reign began in earnest. She was clever, cautious, and charismatic. She stabilized the currency, renewed temples, strengthened trade routes, and walked the delicate line between independence and Roman oversight. All the while, Caesar remained in Alexandria. He stayed through the spring, through the flooding of the Nile, through the festivals and feasts, and in June of 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Swisristine, Philopator, Philometor Caesar, but most would come to know him as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar never publicly acknowledged the child in Rome, but in Egypt, his paternity was assumed. Cleopatra made it clear her son was the heir to two worlds, Egyptian royalty and Roman blood. When Caesar finally departed, Cleopatra did not go with him. She stayed, but her influence traveled. Later that same year, she visited Rome. She arrived not as a guest, but as a queen. She was housed in Caesar's private villa across the Tiber, not far from the city, close enough to be seen, but far enough to stay above scandal, Romans whispered. Some admired her presence, some feared it. She attended games, she met senators, she was introduced to Caesar's allies, and all the while, her golden barge waited at the riverbank. Egyptian servants, musicians, incense rising from bronze burners. It was not love that brought her to Rome. It was diplomacy, presence, power. But then, Caesar died, murdered in the Senate. Cleopatra was still in Rome when it happened, and just like that, everything changed. She left quietly, without ceremony, with her child, her court, and her thoughts, back to Egypt, back to the palace, back to uncertainty. Caesar had no legitimate Roman heir. His will named his great-nephew Octavian, not Caesarion. For Cleopatra, this was more than grief. It was a loss of leverage. The protector of Egypt was gone, and the man now calling himself Caesar, Octavian, was young, ambitious, and not yet proven. Cleopatra returned to ruling. Her brother husband, Ptolemy XIV, soon died, poisoned, many believed. She elevated Caesarion as her co-ruler. Her son, now declared king, he was just 3 years old. And once again, Cleopatra stood alone, but not quietly. She watched Rome from afar, watched Octavian rise, watched Mark Antony emerge as one of its new power centers, and in time, she would meet him too, not in shadows, not by chance, but on the deck of a gilded barge, sailing into legend. The year was 41 BC. Rome no longer belonged to one man. After Caesar's assassination, power was divided between three. The second triumvirate, Octavian, Caesar's heir, Lepidus, the quiet statesman, and Mark Antony, the soldier, the speaker, the man who had once carried Caesar's body through the grieving crowd. While Octavian ruled in the west, Antony took the east, and with it, the responsibility for Egypt. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey. It was not a request, it was an order. But Cleopatra did not arrive as a subject. She arrived as a queen. The journey upriver became a performance, one designed to captivate, intimidate, and mesmerize. Her ship was gilded in gold, its sails dyed purple, its oars silver. Musicians played soft flutes and lyres. Incense drifted across the water. Cleopatra lay beneath a canopy, dressed as the goddess Isis. The people of Tarsus flooded the shore to watch. Even Antony, seasoned by war and politics, was struck. This was no ordinary monarch. This was theater. This was power wrapped in silk and myth. Their meeting was brief and electric. She answered his questions with wit. She matched his confidence with calm. And when she returned to Alexandria, he followed. In the months that came, Antony lived with Cleopatra in Egypt. He relaxed in her court, adopted Egyptian dress, attended feasts and festivals. It was a different world from Rome. Here, he was not just a general. He was a god. Together, they revived the cult of Dionysus and Isis. Their bond was more than affection. It was strategy, spectacle, and something dangerously close to devotion. Cleopatra bore him twins, a boy and a girl, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Later, a third child followed, Ptolemy Philadelphus. With each birth, Cleopatra's position strengthened. She was no longer a guest in the Roman story. She was part of its future. Antony returned to Rome in 40 BC to secure peace with Octavian. He married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a political gesture, but one that created tension. Still, Antony and Cleopatra's connection endured. In 37 BC, they reunited. He left Octavia, returned to Egypt, and with Cleopatra's support, he launched campaigns into Armenia and Parthia. The victories were mixed, some triumphant, others costly, but Antony, ever the showman, staged a lavish celebration in Alexandria. There, on a platform of gold, he declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings. Her children were given titles. Rulers of Armenia, Media, Phoenicia, and Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was declared the true heir of Rome. It was a line too far. To Octavian, this was not diplomacy. It was rebellion. The Senate turned. Octavian presented Antony's will, or what he claimed was his will, in which Antony supposedly asked to be buried in Egypt beside Cleopatra. It was all the Senate needed. In 32 BC, war was declared, not on Antony alone, but on Cleopatra. On Egypt, Rome, once an ally, had become an enemy. Cleopatra prepared. She gathered her fleet, sent grain and supplies, stood beside Antony as the final confrontation loomed. But inside the palace, she must have known. This was not just a battle between generals. This was the closing chapter of a dynasty. Centuries of Ptolemaic rule and centuries of independence now drifting toward the horizon. Like her golden barge, the year was 31 BC. The war between Rome and Egypt had reached its final act. Octavian, Caesar's heir, had rallied the Roman world behind him. He cast Antony as a traitor, a man bewitched by a foreign queen. He called Cleopatra dangerous, exotic, too powerful, too proud. To many in Rome, it didn't matter that she had ruled wisely, that she had fed their grain supply during famine, that she had once been Caesar's ally. She was not Roman, and that was enough. The two sides met near the western coast of Greece, at a place called Actium. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a massive fleet, over 500 ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, but morale was low. Command fractured, supplies dwindled. Octavian's forces, led by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, cut off their escape routes, harassed their supply lines, strangled them slowly. On the day of the battle, September 2nd, Cleopatra's ships were stationed behind Antony's, a reserve force waiting for the right moment. But as the fighting grew chaotic, she made a decision. Her ships turned and sailed away, not in retreat, but in preservation. Antony saw her go, and in that instant, he abandoned the battle. He followed her. Whether it was planned or not, no one knows. But what followed was certain. Without their commanders, Antony's forces collapsed. Octavian claimed victory, and Cleopatra and Antony fled home, back to Alexandria, back to silence. They waited for a year. Some say they hoped for negotiation. Others say they simply wanted time to prepare, to grieve, to let go. They threw one last festival, a mock coronation of death, a farewell to the world they knew. In 30 BC, Octavian arrived in Egypt. The Roman legions approached the gates. There would be no more battles, just endings. Antony, believing Cleopatra was already dead, fell on his sword. But she wasn't. Not yet. Her guards brought him to her, bleeding, broken, and dying in her arms. He spoke to her softly. They say his final words were of courage, of love, of defeat. He died, and the world grew quiet. Cleopatra, now alone, was brought to Octavian. She met him not as a prisoner, but as a queen. She wore her finest robes. She spoke without trembling. She requested that her children be spared, that Egypt remain untouched. But she knew the truth. Rome would take everything. Octavian planned to parade her through the streets in his triumph. A captured queen, humiliated before the people. Cleopatra would not allow it. On August 12th, 30 BC, she died in her chamber. How exactly is still debated. Some say she used a poisonous asp, a cobra smuggled in a basket of figs. Others say it was poison disguised as perfume. The details fade, but the choice was hers. She was 39 years old, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last ruler of her house, a woman who had faced Caesar, loved Antony, defied empires, and shaped history. She was buried beside Antony, as she had requested, and with her death, Egypt fell. Rome absorbed it. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was captured and executed soon after. The children she bore with Antony were taken to Rome. Raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, the Nile grew quiet again, and the golden age of Egyptian independence was over. But Cleopatra's memory was just beginning, and so she was gone. Cleopatra, daughter of the Nile, last of the pharaohs, queen of Egypt, was no more, but her story did not fade with the desert winds. It lingered in marble halls, in whispered myths, in scrolls and songs, passed from empire to empire, generation to generation. The Romans tried to control the narrative. Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, presented Cleopatra as a temptress, a sorceress, a foreign queen who had seduced two of Rome's greatest men. It made the story simpler and more convenient. Rome hadn't just defeated an army, it had conquered desire, tamed chaos, restored order. But Cleopatra was never so simple. She was not just beautiful, though beauty was the cloak history wrapped her in. She was brilliant, multilingual, politically sharp. She negotiated with generals, spoke with philosophers, commanded fleets, balanced the survival of her dynasty against the rising tide of empire, and she lost. But losing does not make a story smaller. Sometimes it makes it echo longer. Cleopatra has been remembered in many ways as a tragic heroine, a cunning manipulator, a goddess, a villain. In truth, she was all of these, and none of them. She was a woman navigating a world built for men, a ruler standing at the edge of an empire not her own, a mother, a strategist, a survivor. She ruled for over 2 decades, longer than many Roman emperors. She protected her people through famine, war, and civil collapse. And when the end came, she chose how to meet it, with dignity, with silence, with gold on her skin. She became a mirror. In every age, reflecting what the world wanted to see. To poets, she was passion. To politicians, danger. To historians, a question. To dreamers, a queen without a throne. But beneath the legend, beneath the veil of seduction and tragedy, there was a person, a young girl born into chaos, a woman who spoke with power, a ruler who made the world take notice, and who refused, even in death, to bow. And so, as you lie there, eyes heavy, breath slow, know this: Cleopatra still walks the banks of memory, in books, in paintings, in films and lullabies, not because of how she died, but because of how she lived. She did not conquer Rome, but Rome never forgot her. The Nile still runs, soft and wide, and somewhere, beyond the reeds, her story sleeps, waiting to be told again. Good night, Cleopatra. Good night, listener. Rest well. Are you still with me? Then stay quiet now, because our next journey begins not in the roar of the Colosseum or the clash of legions, but in a quiet study beneath a high-domed ceiling where a boy sits reading by lamplight. Rome, 121 AD. The empire is strong. Its borders are stretched wide. Its cities buzz with trade and marble and ceremony. But in the house of a noble family, a child is being shaped, not for luxury, but for thought. His name is Marcus Annius Verus. He will one day be known to the world as Marcus Aurelius, the last of the so-called 5 good emperors. But right now, he is only a boy, born into wealth, into a respected patrician family. Marcus could have spent his youth chasing pleasure, but even as a child, he leaned toward silence, toward discipline, toward stillness. He slept on the floor as a young man, even when he didn't have to. He wore simple clothes, even when surrounded by silk. He studied Greek and Latin, read philosophy, before he was old enough to understand grief, and he watched the world around him with clear, quiet eyes. When he was a teenager, he was chosen for something greater. The Emperor Hadrian, aging, clever, paranoid, saw something in him, or perhaps he saw potential in the bloodline. Hadrian first adopted a man named Lucius Aelius as heir, but Aelius died unexpectedly, so Hadrian looked again, this time to Antoninus Pius. Antoninus was mild, honorable, stable. Hadrian named him heir, but with a condition. Antoninus had to adopt Marcus, and so Marcus became a prince, not by birthright, but by design. He moved into the palace. His world changed. Gone were the quiet lessons and evenings with scrolls. Now came politics, ceremony, expectation. But Marcus did not chase power. He still chose the path of the mind. He began studying under the best teachers in Rome, including Junius Rusticus, a Stoic who introduced him to the writings of Epictetus. From Rusticus, Marcus learned not just how to think, but how to endure, to be calm in the face of insult, to separate what we can control from what we cannot. These were not just ideas to Marcus. They became foundations. He copied them, memorized them, lived them, even as he rose higher. Praetor, consul, heir apparent, he remained grounded in thought. While others sought favor, Marcus sought understanding. While others built monuments, Marcus built restraint. He was patient, polite, precise, but he was not naive. He knew the empire was not eternal. He saw corruption in the Senate, luxury in the streets, restlessness in the provinces. Still, he waited. For nearly 2 decades, he stood beside Antoninus Pius, never challenging, never complaining, learning what it meant to rule without being seen. And then, in 161 AD, Antoninus died peacefully, quietly, as he had lived, and Marcus, now 40 years old, became emperor. But he did not take the throne alone, out of humility or obligation or principle. He chose to share power with his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, 2 emperors, 1 empire. It was an unusual arrangement, but Marcus believed in balance, in partnership. He had not trained for power, he had trained for duty. He stepped into the purple robes, not as a conqueror, but as a student of self-control. And Rome held its breath because no one knew then that Marcus Aurelius would be tested more severely than any emperor before him. That storms were coming, plagues, wars, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of an age. But Marcus would face it all with ink-stained fingers and a mind sharpened not by ambition, but by wisdoms. Marcus Aurelius became emperor in 161 AD, but there was no triumph, no celebration, no moment of peace. Almost as soon as he placed the laurel crown upon his brow, the empire began to tremble. Far to the east, Rome's ancient enemy, the Parthian Empire, was stirring. Parthia was powerful, a kingdom of horsemen and gold, stretching from modern-day Iran to the edges of India. Its rulers tested the borders often, but now they had grown bold. They invaded Armenia, a Roman client state, and sent Rome a message. We are not afraid. Marcus had no choice. War was declared, but Marcus did not go. Instead, he sent his co-emperor, Lucius Verus. Verus was the opposite of Marcus in many ways. Charming, luxurious, fond of games and theater. He wore fine clothes, hosted lavish banquets, and traveled east with a glittering entourage. But Marcus trusted him, and Verus delivered. With the help of skilled generals, he pushed back the Parthians, restored Roman control, and returned home, victorious. But he brought something else with him, a sickness. It began as a whisper, a cough in the camps, a fever in the streets, but it spread, fast, unrelenting. The Antonine Plague, as it would later be called, was likely smallpox. It swept across the empire, killing millions. No province was spared. Cities emptied, farms fell silent, even the army grew thin. Marcus did not flee. He stayed in Rome. He organized relief, funded burials, prayed in temples, and watched, helpless. There are no great victories in plague years, only endurance. And yet, in the middle of this suffering, Marcus continued to rule. He passed new laws, supported widows, provided grain to the hungry. He did not use fear to control. He used clarity. And still, the storms came. In the north, along the Danube, Germanic tribes were crossing into Roman territory. They were fleeing their own pressures, hunger, displacement, climate shifts, and invading tribes. But Rome saw only invasion, and so Marcus prepared for war. He trained new legions, raised taxes, and once again, he did not stay behind. He marched with his men north, into the forests and rivers of the frontier, into cold nights, into unfamiliar lands. It was during this campaign that his writing began, not for history, not for anyone else, but for himself. On scraps of parchment, on tablets of wax, in tents lit by flickering oil lamps, he wrote short sentences, reflections, questions. He did not name the work, but centuries later, it would be known as Meditations. It was not philosophy for the world. It was philosophy for survival, for stillness in chaos, for self in a sea of duty. He wrote, "You have power over your mind. not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And do not waste time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. They are not the thoughts of a conqueror. They are the whispers of a tired soul, trying to remain upright in a collapsing world. And even as he wrote, death came close. Lucius Verus, his co-emperor, his brother in title, fell ill in 169 AD. He died quickly. Marcus was alone now, sole ruler of an empire in crisis, a father to many children, but only one surviving son, a soldier, a philosopher, and a man who never asked for the crown he wore. He did not despair. He did not stop. He simply continued, because that was the Stoic way, not to avoid hardship, but to meet it without flinching. He returned to the frontier. He kept writing, kept thinking, because when the world breaks apart, sometimes all a man can do is hold his mind together. The war in the north was not a single campaign. It was a grinding storm, a series of battles, retreats, shifting alliances, and winter fires. Rome called them the Marcomannic Wars, named for the Marcomanni, a confederation of Germanic tribes pushing across the Danube. But they were not the only ones. The Quadi, the Sarmatians, others, unknown to Roman maps, fled famine and unrest from deeper in the continent, searching for land, safety, survival. To the Roman generals, they were invaders. To Marcus, they were a mirror. He saw suffering in every face, not just his own citizens, but in the children huddled behind enemy lines, in the faces of tribal leaders offering uneasy truces. Still, he fought, because he had to, because the empire depended on stability. But his victories were never celebrated with cruelty. He took prisoners and offered them land. He rebuilt shattered towns and fed the starving on both sides of the river. And through it all, he kept writing. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do, say, and think. The words were not for comfort. They were reminders that nothing lasts. Not war, not pain, not power, only character. Even while encamped in the cold forests of Pannonia, he maintained rituals. He rose early, spoke little, wrote in the margins of time. There were nights when the wind screamed through the pines and snow covered tents like shrouds. But Marcus did not leave the frontier. He slept among his men, a ruler who endured rather than commanded. And yet, for all his strength, the years were not kind. He buried many of his children, 6 of them, fever, infection, frailty. One by one, they slipped away. Only his son Commodus survived. He loved his wife, Faustina, but she too died during the campaigns. Her loss was quiet, unwritten in meditations, but it echoes in the tone. There is sorrow beneath the stoic surface, a fatigue woven through the lines. He wrote, "When you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love." He did not rage. He did not fall into despair. He simply endured. And in enduring, he taught. Marcus saw leadership not as glory, but as weight. The emperor was not a god, not a tyrant, but a man, with a mind to govern and a soul to guard. And so, even as the battles raged, even as his health declined, he kept to his discipline, calm, measured, unmoved by praise, unafraid of blame. He knew the empire was changing, that nothing built by men could last forever. But that wasn't the point. The point was how a man lived while it lasted, with honor, with duty, with thoughtfulness, even under siege. The war in the north dragged on, and though Marcus Aurelius fought with wisdom and restraint, his body grew tired. His joints ached, his breathing slowed, but still, he did not stop. Then came a letter, carried in haste, its words dry, clipped, urgent, a rebellion in the east. One of his most trusted generals, Avidius Cassius, had declared himself emperor. He claimed Marcus was dead, that the empire needed leadership, that Rome could not wait. It was a lie. Marcus lived, but now he was betrayed. Cassius had governed the eastern provinces well. He was respected, feared, ambitious, but ambition without truth is fire. When news of the rebellion spread, the empire paused. Would Marcus retaliate? Would he send legions in anger? No. He waited. He mourned the betrayal, but not with rage. He asked the Senate not for vengeance, but for calm. He wrote, "To expect bad men not to do wrong is to ask the impossible. It is better to be gentle with all." He prepared to march east, not as a conqueror, but as a man repairing a fracture. But before he arrived, Cassius was killed by his own soldiers, beheaded. His rebellion ended, not in battle, but in silence. Marcus could have paraded the head through the streets. He could have punished the general's family. Instead, he wept and forgave. Even now, after war, loss, and betrayal, Marcus clung to principle, not weakness, but control. He returned to Rome, slowly, through cities that welcomed him with flowers and cheers. And still, he did not rest. He revised laws, strengthened the grain supply, visited provinces, met with governors, healed what he could. But his eyes were on the future, on his son, Commodus. The boy was different. Where Marcus was quiet, Commodus was loud. Where Marcus fasted, Commodus feasted. He trained as a gladiator, loved gold and games and praise. But he was Marcus's only surviving heir, and the emperor, for all his philosophy, was still a father. He named Commodus Caesar, and later Augustus, co-emperor. Some said it was his one great failure, that the philosopher had given Rome a tyrant. But Marcus believed in legacy, in teaching. He hoped, perhaps too much, that what he wrote, what he lived, would shape the boy more than the temptations of power. Still, he feared what was coming. In his writings, the tone shifts. The words grow heavier, not bitter, but resigned. Soon you will have forgotten all things, and soon all things will have forgotten you. He knew he was near the end. The empire was brittle, its edges frayed, and yet it still stood, because he had held it, not with force, but with patience. He returned once more to the Danube frontier, where the wars had started, where his men still held the line. He was older now, thin, slow, but his presence calmed the legions. He visited the wounded, wrote in his journal, and walked the camp in the cold evening air, watching fires burn against the dark. He had done what he could, lived as best he knew how, not as a god, not as a conqueror, but as a man. One more man in a long chain of rulers, trying to leave the world a little less cruel. The Danube was quiet in the early spring of 180 AD. The snow had begun to melt. The rivers ran thick with memory, and in a small military camp near the frontier, the emperor, once boy, then man, then ruler, lay dying. Marcus Aurelius had spent the last years of his life trying to hold the empire together with discipline, wisdom, and hope. But now his breath was shallow, his body thin. He had fought for too long, and now, finally, there was nothing left to endure. Some say he gathered his officers for one last talk. Some say he whispered lessons to Commodus. Others say he passed quietly with only a few attendants at his side. What we know is this: Marcus Aurelius died on March the 17th, 180 AD. His final words are unknown, but they didn't need to be spoken. They had already been written in the margins of notebooks, in the corners of silence, in the space between duty and grief. Death smiles at us all. All a man can do is smile back. With his death came the end of an era. He was the last of the 5 good emperors, a line that had ruled not with birthright, but with reason. After Marcus, Rome would never be the same. Commodus took the throne, young, impulsive, hungry for admiration, not reflection. He abandoned the war in the north. He returned to Rome in golden robes, proclaimed himself a god, fought in the arena, renamed the months after himself. The Senate, once wary, now trembled. The people, once proud, now watched from shadows. The philosopher's son had become a performer, and the empire shifted. Some historians say Marcus's greatest flaw was naming Commodus as his heir, that the man who had lived by the Stoic rule of reason had failed to apply it to his own blood. But others see something more human, a father who hoped his teachings would hold, who believed that love and writing could shape a better ruler. Perhaps he was wrong, but perhaps he simply hoped, and hope too is part of being human. Today, few remember the borders Marcus defended. Few recall the details of his tax reforms, or his legislation for slaves, or the cities he rebuilt after plague. But they remember his words, meditations, never meant to be published, never addressed to anyone but himself, has been translated into every language, read by emperors, soldiers, scholars, and those simply trying to sleep, not because it offers answers, but because it offers quiet reminders to be kind, to be calm, to act with intention, even when the world is cruel. In the end, Marcus did not leave behind a perfect empire. He left behind something smaller, something quieter, a way to live. And if you're still awake, or if you're already drifting, remember this: you don't have to be emperor of the world to carry yourself with dignity. You don't have to rule armies to rule your own breath. You only have to try to act with reason, to walk gently, to hold yourself to your own highest standard, even when no one's looking, especially then. That was Marcus Aurelius. That was his legacy, and now it is yours too. Good night, Emperor. Good night, listener. Sleep well. Are you still with me? Then settle in, because tonight we begin a long, slow march, not with armies, but with memory, across seas and sand. Beyond the Italian hills and Roman marble, there was once a city called Carthage. It was rich, powerful, built on trade and sea routes, on purple dye and the silver mines, on ships faster than the wind. Carthage stood in North Africa, in what is now Tunisia, with white-walled homes, palm trees swaying in salt air, and temples that smelled of incense and old gods. And there, in the year 247 BC, a boy was born into war. His name was Hannibal. His father was Hamilcar Barca, a general, hardened, proud, and patient. Hamilcar had fought in the First Punic War, a brutal, grinding conflict between Carthage and Rome that stretched across 2 decades and ended in bitterness. Carthage had lost, not because it was weak, but because it hesitated. Rome was relentless. Carthage had been strategic, and Rome punished them for it. They stripped Carthage of its navies, demanded crushing payments of silver, took away land, humiliated them. Hamilcar did not forget, and his son just a boy at the time, watched the embers of that loss burn in his father's eyes. He grew up not in softness, but in discipline, taught to ride, to speak multiple languages, to read Greek philosophy and study Roman law, not to admire it, but to know his enemy. And one day, while still young, perhaps 9 years old, Hamilcar brought him to an altar. He placed the boy's hand upon a flame and asked him to swear an oath to never be a friend to Rome, to fight them until death, to never forgive. And Hannibal swore. He did not ask why, because by then he had already learned what Rome was, a power that did not sleep, a republic that never forgot a threat, an empire in waiting. Hannibal was not raised to coexist. He was raised to resist. When he was a teenager, Hamilcar set sail for Spain, then called Iberia, with his sons and soldiers. He had no interest in watching Carthage grow old and cautious. He built a new base, expanded territory, secured alliances with local tribes, and there, as Hannibal grew into manhood, he trained in the art of war, not just with swords, but with terrain. He studied mountains, rivers, supply chains, language, fear. He learned to ride alongside elephants, to command mixed armies of Carthaginians, Iberians, Numidians, each with different strengths and different loyalties. When Hamilcar died, drowned during a campaign, his son-in-law Hasdrubal took over command, but Hannibal remained a rising star, beloved by soldiers, respected by officers. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army did not hesitate. They chose Hannibal. He was just 26 years old. He had never ruled a city, never been a politician. He had no senate to lean on, no treaties to hide behind, but he had an oath and a memory. Rome still watched from across the sea, still demanded Carthage remain small, safe, contained. But Hannibal did not plan to stay in Carthage. He had something else in mind, not defense, but vengeance. The oath was not forgotten. Hannibal, now general of Carthaginian forces in Iberia, did not rush toward Rome. He moved deliberately. First, he secured Spain. He led campaigns along the Iberian coast, absorbing cities into Carthaginian control, some by alliance, some by siege. His army grew: Carthaginian corps, Iberian swords, Numidian cavalry, and elephants. Massive, slow, but terrifying to Roman eyes. Then he made his move. At the time, the Ebro River marked a loose boundary. North of it, Roman influence. South of it, Carthaginian control. Crossing that river meant war, and Hannibal crossed it, not with a declaration, but with dust. Thousands of soldiers, pack animals, engineers, camp followers, and elephants. Rome sent messengers, warnings, demands, but Hannibal didn't answer. He marched north, toward the Pyrenees, through rough paths and hill tribes, losing men, but never momentum. When he reached the Rhone River, he faced another obstacle. The water was wide and fast. The Romans had sent scouts. They knew he was coming. They didn't believe he'd keep going. He did. His engineers built rafts. Elephants were coaxed, dragged, swum across. It was not smooth. It was not easy, but it was done. And then, the Alps. No one expected it. No general had ever attempted to bring an army, let alone elephants, through the snow-covered mountains and into Italy. But Hannibal understood something about fear. If you go where no one believes you can, you win half the war before the first sword is drawn. The climb was brutal. Freezing winds, narrow paths, avalanches, tribes ambushing from the cliffs, animals slipping from ledges, men dying in silence. Weeks passed. From the heights, his soldiers could see Italy below, green fields, Roman soil, the promise of victory if they could survive the descent. When Hannibal finally emerged from the Alps, his army was a shadow of what it had been. He had lost perhaps half his men. Many elephants were dead. The survivors were starving, exhausted, but they had done the impossible. They had crossed into Italy, and they had brought war with them. Rome was shocked. They had not expected a foreign army to appear on their side of the mountains. It was bold, unthinkable, and it was just beginning. Hannibal wasted no time. He gathered what strength he had left and marched toward the Po Valley, where fresh supplies could be secured and alliances with northern Italian tribes could be formed. Some welcomed him, many feared him, but all understood. Something unstoppable had arrived. Rome mobilized. They sent legions north, expecting to corner him quickly. They did not know they were chasing a shadow that could see in the dark. Hannibal did not march with chaos. He marched with purpose. Every mile through Italy, he studied the land, the rivers, the valleys, the narrow passes. He listened to local tribes, offered gold where it was needed, fear where it was more effective. Rome responded with legions. They assumed he would retreat, that after the Alps, he would hide or flee. But Hannibal didn't come to escape. He came to dismantle them. The first true test came at the Trebia River. In the bitter cold of winter, the Romans had superior numbers, but they lacked patience. Hannibal baited them. He sent light cavalry to harass the Roman lines, knowing pride would override caution. The Romans charged across the icy river, half frozen and disorganized. Hannibal struck from the sides. His brother Mago emerged from concealment behind them. The legions were surrounded, pressed into mud, cut down. It was not just a battle, it was a message. Rome did not panic, but it did worry. The next spring, another army approached, and again, Hannibal led them to their own destruction. This time, near a quiet body of water called Lake Trasimene. There was a fog, a stillness, and a narrow path between the lake and the hills. Hannibal placed his men along the ridges, hidden in the mist. He left a small force ahead, just visible enough to pull the Romans in. They followed, confidently. Then, on Hannibal's signal, horns pierced the fog. Cavalry swept in from behind. Infantry poured from the hills. The Romans were caught, boxed between the lake and rising earth. Thousands died without ever seeing the full shape of the army around them. It was the largest ambush in history up to that point. Over 15,000 Romans were killed. Others drowned. Some never even drew their swords. Rome was shaken. Panic stirred in the Senate. And still, Hannibal did not march on the capital. He could have, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he moved south, looking for alliances, trying to break Rome from within. But most cities did not join him. They feared Roman vengeance more than they admired Carthaginian victory. So Hannibal changed tactics. He planned a battle Rome would have to fight. Not a raid, not a trap, but a full confrontation on open land, under a hot sun, near a small town called Cannae. The Romans sent everything: 8 legions, cavalry, allies, over 80,000 men. The largest force they had ever assembled. Hannibal had fewer men, fewer horses, but he had something more important: a plan. He arranged his troops in a gentle curve, with the center pushed forward and the wings drawn back. The Romans charged the center, as expected, thinking they had broken through. But as they pushed forward, the wings of Hannibal's army closed in. Then the cavalry swept around and struck from the rear. The Romans were surrounded, completely trapped in a circle. pressed tighter and tighter, unable to move, unable to breathe. The slaughter lasted for hours. By sunset, as many as 50,000 Roman soldiers were dead. It was Rome's darkest day, and Hannibal, calm, patient, relentless, had won the greatest tactical victory in ancient history. But still, Rome did not fall, because while Hannibal knew how to defeat legions, he could not yet break the city's will. The Republic did not sue for peace. It simply adapted and began to wait. Hannibal had done the impossible. He had crossed mountains, defeated army after army, humiliated Rome on its own soil. But the war was not over, because Rome was not built on brilliance. It was built on persistence. After Cannae, many expected surrender, but Rome did the opposite. They banned mourning in public. They recruited boys barely of age. They trained new legions with fresh weapons and a new mindset. No more rushing into traps. Now, they would wait. They chose a new strategy. Named after a man, Fabius Maximus. He was cautious. Some said cowardly, but his method worked. He avoided direct battle. He followed Hannibal from a distance, burned crops ahead of him, cut off supplies, refused to engage. Hannibal, so used to controlling the rhythm of war, found himself stranded. He could win battles, but not food, not reinforcements. And his pleas to Carthage for more support were met with delays. The Carthaginian Senate was divided. Some feared Hannibal's rise. Others argued the war should be contained, not expanded. So, while Rome grew stronger, Hannibal waited. He still won skirmishes, still inspired fear, but he could not conquer Rome without more men, more elephants, more gold. Years passed. His army thinned. Allies grew uncertain. Some cities defected, and slowly, Rome began to strike back. First, they took back southern Italy, then Spain. Then, they sent a new general to North Africa, one young enough to take risks, old enough to know their cost. His name was Scipio. He had studied Hannibal's tactics, learned from Cannae, Trebia, Trasimene. He knew Rome could not win by avoiding Hannibal forever. They had to draw him out, away from Italy, back to defend his own home. So his Scipio landed near Carthage, burning crops, taking cities, threatening the heart of Hannibal's world. Carthage panicked. At last, they called Hannibal home. After 16 years in Italy, he boarded a ship and returned to Africa. He was older now, tired, but still sharp. The final confrontation came near a town called Zama. Two giants, two philosophies. Scipio, with his calm confidence and Roman discipline. Hannibal, with his instinct, experience, and fading strength. They met face to face before the battle. Two men who had studied each other's lives, who knew the weight of war. They spoke briefly, respectfully, but neither yielded. At Zama, the elephants charged first, but Scipio's soldiers opened lanes, letting them pass harmlessly through. Then, the infantry clashed. Roman discipline met Carthaginian resolve. The fight was brutal, close, and then Scipio's cavalry returned from a wide arc, crashing into Hannibal's rear. For the first time in his life, Hannibal was defeated in open battle. He did not panic. He did not beg. He simply retreated. Knowing the war was lost, Carthage surrendered. The Second Punic War was over. Rome imposed harsh terms, took lands, stripped Carthage of its army, and Hannibal? He disappeared from the battlefield, but not from history. The war was over, but Hannibal still breathed. He returned to Carthage not in triumph, but in defeat. Quiet, stoic, burdened by what could have been. He had lost Zama, but Carthage still stood, bruised, reduced, alive, and Hannibal, now past 50, refused to disappear. He turned to politics. He became a magistrate, reformed taxes, cracked down on corruption, made enemies. Rome watched with unease. The man they had feared for so long was rebuilding Carthage's strength, not with spears, but with laws. They sent envoys, filed complaints, whispered threats. Eventually, Carthaginian elites, jealous, cautious, weary of Roman pressure, forced Hannibal to flee, so he left, exiled. Again, he wandered east, offering his mind to foreign kings, in Tyre, in Antioch, in Bithynia. He advised generals, designed defenses, studied the new shape of the world. But Rome never forgot. Everywhere he went, Rome followed, demanding his arrest, pressuring allies, searching for the ghost who haunted their legacy. And so he kept moving, a legend without a homeland. At last, he found a small place to rest, on the edge of the Sea of Marmara, in modern-day Turkey. But even there, he was hunted. Roman envoys came one final time, surrounding the village, demanding surrender. And there, in solitude, Hannibal made his choice. He would not give them the satisfaction. He drank poison, quietly, deliberately. It is said he left behind a note. Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. No theatrics, no farewell speech, just a man deciding the final move of his long campaign. He died around 183 BC. No army, no war elephants, no banners. But he remained in whispers, in military academies, in Roman nightmares. Centuries later, even Scipio Africanus, his great rival, spoke of Hannibal with respect. He said, "Of all generals, I would place Hannibal second, and myself first, if I had defeated him. But since I haven't, I give him the top place." And the Romans, the very people he nearly destroyed, eventually engraved his story in stone, not to mock it, but to remember it, because Hannibal represented something they could not ignore, a reminder that even the most powerful empires can be challenged by one determined, disciplined, brilliant soul. And now, as you lie back, perhaps with your fan humming, lights dim, drifting slowly towards sleep, remember Hannibal, not just the warrior, but the strategist, the survivor, the exile who never begged. He did not win the war, but he won something quieter, immortality, not in marble, but in memory. And now, in your own quiet mind, good night, Hannibal. Good night, listener. Sleep well.